Hi, my name's Relevant. We're back with the Garnet Revolution 3. The new tubes for it came in, and today I'm going to be running you through the preamp circuit inside this amp, so you know what tubes do what, and how to tweak on the tone. Now in the previous episode, we determined that some tubestore.com value 20 tubes were going to fill the bill for us. It's hit or miss whether or not that's going to apply to your amp. I guess if the circuit is designed identically with the same bias resistor, it's entirely possible. The preamp section, well, heck of a lot more straightforward. You can pretty much just hot swap those tubes however way you want. Seen here is a roughly electrically accurate diagram of the preamp circuit in this amp. I've cranked the contrast on the camera roll weird and set it to black and white so it shows up real good. Try not to be too creeped out by how my hands look. These are the 5 preamp tubes in order from the input side over here. Input 1 goes into the first half of tube 1, then to its gain knob, and then into the second half of tube 1 and out to the main bus. Much of the same way, input 2 from channel 2 goes into the first half of tube 2 through the gain knob and then into the second half of tube 2 and then out to the main bus. Now the second channel is also the reverb channel. So the output from tube 2 directly feeds into the reverb send, which boosts the signal and sends it out to the reverb tank. The reverb tank returns over here into the first half of tube 5. Then it goes over to the second half of tube 3. Out of tube 3, it goes to the reverb level and then into the main bus. Now I guess they wanted a 12AX7 gain level to preamp the signal coming back from the reverb tank, and then the 12AU7 buffers it. While we're on the topic of tube 5, the second half runs the tremolo circuit. For tube 4, it does 2 different things. The main bus feeds into it, it buffers and amplifies that, then it goes out to the master volume, and then into the second half, which is a short tail phase inverter that splits the signal to drive the power tubes. Also on the first half of tube 4, this is where feedback is introduced. I'm not going to get into what feedback does now, but the tube guys out there who know what that is, this is where it's introduced into the circuit. That said, if you want to tone model this amp, maybe try different flavors of preamp tubes, you only really need 2 extra tubes. Depending on what channel you want to use, you only have to swap out 1 tube to affect that channel. And then because tube 4 is your channel buffer and your phase inverter, that's the other one you're going to have to work on. Now, tube 1, tube 2, and tube 4, those are the ones that are going to affect your tone most profoundly. And of course, tube 1 and tube 2 affecting their respective channels. So yeah, you can focus on working with 1 channel, especially if there's only 1 channel you care about, and only change 1 of those tubes and this one, and that's going to be what changes your tone in the preamp the most. Now the tremolo circuit isn't going to affect your tone at all if you change that tube. It's not in the signal path. It's a kind of bias modulator. The tremolo in this amp works by turning the power output level of the power section up and down by changing the bias of the tubes themselves. That's one of the reasons why the tremolo on these old amps is a very dynamic and punchy effect compared to, say, an effects pedal. Now, the jury's out on how much changing these 2 tubes here, tube 3 and 5, is going to affect your tone. Obviously, they're not going to come into play unless you are using the reverb, and even at that, because they're basically going to be reproducing the tones generated by the other tubes, I would opt for just a good clean sounding tube for them, and I wouldn't focus too much on them. Now, if certain aspects of this diagram aren't making sense to you, for reference, any given preamp tube in the 12AX line has 2 physical preamp circuits in it. That's why if you look closely at one of them, you can see there's 2 physical elements inside. So hence why on this diagram we're talking about the first half of a tube and a second half of a tube, and why 1 tube can have enough amplification to do a whole channel in and of itself. Now, as we know, we have 2 12AX7s, 2 12AU7s, and another 12AX7. Now, these don't necessarily have to be 12AU7s. You can manipulate these values to further affect the tone or the response of your amp. I found in practice that the 12AU7 in the reverb position here, position 3, you know, it had your typical reverb tone. But in testing, if I put a stronger tube in there like the 12AX7, I got this deep, dank, kind of just underwater surf kind of reverb. It was actually quite interesting. So you can play with the value of this tube to affect just the depth of your reverb. 12AU7 here on the phase inverter buffer circuit. For the most part, that's something I'd leave alone. You could try boosting it up if you want to drive your back end more, if you want more breakup and saturation in your power section. Now for this guy's particular amp, I've already previously determined that a tube store value 20 tube is going to sit in the bias range that we want. I can't speak for your amp. If it's designed identically with the identical components and the identical bias resistor, which I forgot to make note of, then chances are you can use value 22. But in practice, anytime you retube the power tubes in the amp, you need to check your bias. We just got some bog standard JJ6L6 GCs for him. Basically, whenever I'm retubing an amp and I need power tubes and I'm not sure what I want, I just stick with the JJs. They make a good solid tube. I've never been disappointed with the sound of a JJ power tube, and they tend to be a little bit cheaper than the other guys. For the preamp tubes is where we're really gonna mix it up. To enhance his reverb a little bit, we're bumping it up to a 12AT7. I found that was a good balance between the natural reverb sound the amps comes with and a little bit more of that saturated reverb underwater surf sound for him to play with. And then we got your 12AU7 for the buffer and phase inverter position as prescribed. Now I'm using tongue saw tubes for these. The tongue saw tubes are the ones that I tend to default to. I like them in my phase inverter. If I want a good clean sounding tube that just has to work as a buffer or a basic amplifier like these positions, that's the tube I prefer. For clean tones and a bass amp, I find they have a more well-rounded sound and a good bass response, especially compared to, say, a JJ-ECC83. The JJ-ECC83 is a very robust tube. I like it as another default tube if I don't know what I want. It doesn't have my favorite distortion tone. I find it's more grainy, but it always tends to work well. But I prefer the tongue saws for the good, clean booster positions over this. This is a tube that I like to play with when I'm trying to model the texture of my distortion tone. Now I got this guy 3 different 12AX7s to play with. The JJ-ECC83S is a form of 12AX7 tube. They just have a different nomenclature. Then we have a tongue saw 12AX7 and a Svetlana 12AX7. These 3 tubes are ones that I know. I have a hard time describing the tone of the Svetlana because it's a tube that's newer to me, but you know, distortion wise, I find the tongue saw is a bit more fuzzy, the JJ is a bit more grainy, and the Svetlana, it has a pretty good defined mid. So basically, what Buddy can do is he has 3 different tones to work with that he can juggle around. Because these 2 channels are independent for each other, we don't need to do any matching. He can go like this and, you know, he can try these 2 different sounds, swap them around, or maybe he likes doing it like this. So whatever tube he likes the least, he can throw down here in the reverb return tremolo section. Whichever tube he likes the most, he can put it up here in his channel 2 because he said he prefers channel 2 and never uses channel 1 really. That said, it gives him an extra 12AX7 to work with if maybe he likes a more saturated reverb, or maybe he wants to boost up his phase inverter output with a 12AT7, and then, you know, we can just take this AU7 and sit it over here or put it on the shelf. In theory, if you never use channel 1, you never have to retube it at all. You might not even have to put a tube in there. The amp's not really gonna care, or at least it shouldn't. But yeah, when you have situations of cascade, like in higher gain amps, like say a Marshall JCM800, where the first 2 tubes all affect the distortion texture of that channel, yeah, you're gonna want maybe a pair of matching tubes to start off with for those 2 first positions so you get a feel of what that tube's going to do for the tone. But in here, he's got a little bit more flexibility. So we got him a mixed bag here so he can really play around with it. Now that this is all said and done, let's go ahead and pop these into the amp and see what happens. All right, here we are by the amp. Well, let's get tubing on this thing. Now, due to the nature of how this amp is designed, it's kind of hard to really see the tubes in there. Preamp tubes are more accessible with the power tubes out of place. Remember, they have those claws on the power tubes that you kind of have to push back a bit. I'll take my example tubes out of here. And now I got to feel around for the preamp tubes. A little bit easier to get at the preamp tubes with the power tubes out of the way. Now the first tube is right here. We're gonna stick the JJ in there, because that's the channel he prefers the least. And the JJ is the tube I have the least expectations from for this amp. And I pull the tube out, pull it straight down, and then try to get it out so you can get an idea of which way you're gonna be putting the tube in, so you're not sitting there twisting or trying to figure it out. In the second position, we're gonna put the Svetlana. Tube modeling this amp might be easier with the chassis removed, so you can get at the tubes easier. Position 3 is a 12AU reverb return. That's going to be the 12AT7. Position 4, buffer phase inverter, Tungsol 12AU7. And that one is behind one of the transformers, so it's a real contort job getting at it. And then finally, position 5, tremolo and reverb return, which might also be a good candidate for the JJ. Let's get the guards back on. They're not twist guards, they just kind of push on there. And you might want to flex on the little fingers there so it holds them tight. These guys, guards of this type can rattle loose on you. I actually found one of them at the bottom of the amp when I got it. All right, so on with the power tubes. Nice fresh 6L6. The base is a bit narrower. We're gonna squeeze on the bear trap a bit and stick her in there. On this second power tube, I'm gonna hook up my special tool so I can double check to see how the bias on these is sitting. That's assuming it clears the speaker. Oh yeah, we'll be okay. Let's get this pupper prop back up and turned on. All right, let's see what we have here. That sounds good, man. Bass is up. The numbers on our meter look a touch low, but you know, better to run a bit too cold than a bit too hot. Don't mind the negative. That's just because I got the leads hooked up backwards. It's going to, it's still telling me the numbers I need to know. That's reverb cranked. It almost has like a delay-like texture to it. It almost sounds like there's delay on it. Almost a bit too much, almost drones. Let's make it a bit more conservative. Now let's compare channel 1 and channel 2. It shows up on this recording, but they definitely do sound different. Whether that's the channel or the tube itself, I don't know, because the circuits are a little bit different. Let's do a little bit of crank action. Well, at least with the gain. Back to channel 1. Try the same thing. It's got a little bit more grit to it. That could very well be the JJ tube. I'm wondering what happens if we introduce a little overdrive. Got just your bog standard boss pedal here. Nothing special. A little bit of overdrive. We can actually maybe pull off a little bit of rock metal, except I'm finding the sound's thinning out. We might have to turn her up a bit to get some little bit more beef out of it, unless channel 2 sounded a touch more beefy. Now, one old trick sometimes is to jumper those two channels together to really push the back end. Will my jumper lead reach? Oh, just maybe. Yeah, it's definitely giving us more saturation. reverb tone isn't anywhere near as profound with everything cranked up the way it is. Well, the only other thing to do is to actually wind this amp up a bit, see what it really does. Oh boy. Oh, my ears. A lot of mid squonk to it. Not a lot of low end, but you got old speakers in an open back cab, what do you expect? We can do one more little test to see what it sounds like with a good cab. right, well, I think we made our point here. Like a good old classic vintage amp, you know, if you rub the knobs the right way, you can get it to do quite a few different things. In this case, we have a situation where we can damn near crank it out and then get a bunch of things to happen with just the controls on our guitar. That's what all this here is for anyway. Z50 wasn't rolling? The amp's working great now, and like a good old tube amp, the louder you crank it, the better it gets. A little bit too much. Even tried it with a good cab, and it does sound much better. With the channels jumpered and cranked all out, you can get a variety of tones out of this with the master at about, you know, halfway, 3/4. The amp gets loud, but you can go from clean to dirty with a flick of a knob on your guitar, just the way it should be, or at least the way it used to be. So if you like this kind of thing, well, stay tuned, because I plan on doing more of this. It's few and far between. It's whenever I get my hands on an amp that comes through the shop. But you know what? If you know what certain tubes do, that can make it a heck of a lot easier to model your amp and get the sounds that you want out of it.